Now, as many of you know, the array of topics on this channel that we have covered have ranged far and wide. And for the most part, I always like to defer and wait to cover subject matter until I can almost solve some portion of a mystery, or at least add something new to the discussion, because my end goal at the end of every video is to come to a reasonable enough explanation to cover a situation in its entirety. But in today's video, that is a bit different because after spending hours and hours trying to come up with some sort of lead, some sort of reasonable explanation that I prefer over another theory, and to tell you the truth, with this one, I'm no closer to figuring this out than when I first started. And the realm of this mystery is a bit different than past videos as well, because this very obscure VHS tape from the 1990s is so incredibly morbid that I would best describe it as a person trying to make some sort of children's entertainment, but over the film's production, it seems like whoever was responsible for this slowly starts to mentally deteriorate, breaking down all aspects of storytelling and educational value. I'm very well tempted to label this the most mysterious VHS tape on the internet because the fact that not a single detail of this film's origin can be confirmed, and while I'd normally remain skeptical, its sporadic leaking onto the internet over the course of decades has made me very much so buy into the fact that this is legitimate, and not some sort of just hoax ARG film meant to spook the internet. Now, as to not get too far ahead of myself in terms of my look into this topic, let me shift focus back to June of this year when I was first made aware of this mysterious VHS tape. And that was when a user by the name of Castigamat had posted about this on the r/obscure media subreddit in a post titled, Nanny Lynn 1996, a weird grotesque Amiga cartoon animation apparently found on an unlabeled VHS tape. It includes 3 tragic stories, probably with educational purposes. The story titled Srebrenica can be seen as an allegory about a 95 that took place in Bosnia. I couldn't find any info around. Now, this piqued my curiosity as I wondered what person could make a children's film discussing a and soon I found myself clicking on the video and surprisingly sitting through 60 minutes of that fever dream. Users on Reddit seem to be in unanimous agreement that this is probably one of the most bizarre and obscure titles that they have run across on the subreddit. And while we will discuss the Srebrenica allegory and all the specific contents of the film in detail later, just know that after watching the full thing, it was definitely nothing like I expected it to be, let alone the fact that I sat through the entire thing, which caused me to be way too invested in this topic. While the film starts off very tame, I will note it becomes progressively more bizarre and morbid the longer you sit through it, with at times the narrator's voice feeling like they had gone off script or impromptu.
Better than you, he said, and he carefully started walking around the cage to make legs. Went so fast they began to dissolve, and soon poor Bob the Blob was just a pile of powder. The lady white rat decided to take a little taste. This tastes pretty good, she thought, and she licked it until suddenly it changed again and became something like a lizard.
Paired the soft-spoken and detached grandmother narrating juxtaposed over the potential discussion of a massacre being explained to children, and oh, did I mention in one of the stories they launch a nuke into a cat's ass, and that cat was a rat and also a lizard at one point. So yeah, this is a very weird video, and I will state that at the end of it, I really had no idea what the hell I just watched, and I still really don't know. At the end of the video, I will note it did state this, however.
Because he was still very unstable. But finally he decided to stay a cat. And that was the end, because they stayed that way forever after. The boys really loved their pet Bob. I hope you like these stories from Nanny Lynn Videos.
The way she says Nanny Lynn Videos makes it sound like there's more to this company. And given the fact there's a copyright at the beginning of the video as well, it makes it seem like this is a bit of a series. However, a quick Google search for the film and company behind it yielded absolutely no results, with the only info seemingly to have been from previous discussions of a third of the film dating back as far as 2007, because only the second story out of the 3 was available on the internet for 13 years, as the individual film has circulated between collectors. Pair this with the backstory of it being found on an unmarked VHS tape, and you've got yourself a mystery, as nobody knows who the hell made this video and what the actual intended purpose of it was. Now, this is particularly bizarre because clearly some effort or money went into its production despite its crude animation. And something I've learned after looking past the surface level of this genre is that these bizarre one-off titles are kind of their own little underground world. Now, if you're familiar with another topic by the name of the most mysterious song on the internet, the situation is actually very similar to that one. And to give you the TLDR, it is essentially another popular internet mystery where a song seeming to be from a foreign band, very reminiscent of a Depeche Mode sometime around the 80s, had a song played on the radio that to this day nobody can track down who actually was responsible for the track. And just like Nanny Lynn, it remains an unclaimed piece of media to this day. Now, Justin Whang has covered this topic extensively, and given that he's sort of my go-to when it comes to bizarre and disturbing media on YouTube, I thought it would be cool to have him on my channel to give us more background on obscure media as a whole and the origins of this particular film.
As you can imagine, stumbling on an unmarked VHS tape can be a trailhead for a bizarre glimpse into someone else's life. Around the 90s, collections of rare and obscure VHS tapes were sought after and traded among collectors, as the golden age of the internet hadn't yet made obscure media more accessible. While some people collected things as simple as VHS movies, on the other hand, the accessibility of home recordings gave rise to the genre of found home footage. But as many of you know, the aesthetic of 90s VHS tapes tends to have a bit of a creepy aesthetic to it, especially when taken out of context. For instance, if you've heard of the YouTube channel Memory Hole, it's a collection of rejected tapes submitted for America's Funniest Home Videos. While the creators often thought these videos were funny, watching them today often gives a completely different effect. And while each piece of media tends to have a story around its creation, that can't be said about what we're about to take a look at. The piece of entertainment I'm referring to is the Nanny Lynn children's entertainment film. This 62-minute VHS tape contains 3 individual stories that take an unexpected turn. And they're not something you typically want your children watching. This VHS tape is morbid, as it's animated in a vintage Amiga fashion with an irregular woman's voice speaking over it. While we'll get to the contents of these tapes in a bit, let's go over some of the background information. Based on the internet search so far, these tapes have no discernible origin, and no real publication seems to have backed its release. It's believed that this VHS was made in 1997, as the beginning of the tapes say copyright by Nanny Lynn Videos. And while the beginning of the film cites Hanson Video, Hanson only seems to be the ones recently responsible for circulating the video, not actually creating it back in 1997. While portions of the video can be found online dating back as far as 13 years, and there's various Reddit discussions about it throughout the years, there really isn't much info at all. In fact, we wouldn't even get full access to the video until May of this year. This was when the owner of Hanson Records, Aaron Dilloway, would make a statement after being asked several times where parts of the VHS originated from. His statement read as follows: "These are some very rare children's computer animations made by a woman calling herself Nanny Lynn. My friend rescued this from obscurity when they were brought into a Michigan video duplication place she was working at in roughly 1997. She said the original order was made to duplicate in PAL format. She made some extra copies and would leave them randomly at parties. I bootlegged the hell out of it throughout the late 90s on VHS and early 2000s through my old DVD company, Meatwood Media, and got them out through my Hanson Records noise distro. Gave a copy to Sam at 5 Minutes to Live, who also spread it. Jacob Chiocchi at Paper Rad considers it a big influence on his work. He uploaded one of the stories to YouTube years ago, but here is the full 62 minutes of eye-bleeding, confusing children's entertainment for you all to see. If anyone knows the real Nanny Lynn who made these, please put me in touch. Aaron Dilloway." And looking online for all the other sources for this film, Aaron's story seems to check out. But to understand why this film has gotten the internet's attention, let's dive into its plot. Then you'll truly start to question the sanity of the person who created it, as well as whoever this was intended for.
Now, moving on to the actual contents of the film, and I'll preface this by saying that I've included a link to the full video if you'd like to experience this for yourself. However, I can imagine that many of you don't have the patience to sit through this 60-minute film, and I'm going to summarize the entire plot, I guess you could even call it that, in this portion of the video. Moving on with the first story out of the three is Princess Amaluma, which is actually the most normal out of the three, with it seeming to still have some educational and story-driven component to it. It begins with the main character, the princess, deciding that she's tired of looking at pictures of dinosaurs in her book and decides she wants to, quote,
touch real dinosaurs.
So she goes back to ask her dad, who is also the king, to go back in time 60 million years to
touch real dinosaurs.
Being the responsible father figure that the king is, he decides to disco finger the air and eventually creates a time bubble for his daughter, who later gets in said time bubble, but not after grabbing a bunch of feathers as a present to give to the dinosaurs. Now, when I say that this story in particular is the most normal out of the three, it is what you'd expect from a kid show. It spends much of the time naming the dinosaurs and their colors, and in the rest of the plot, it consists of the dinosaurs becoming obsessed with their looks after they are given feathers, until eventually a few of them end up falling in the lake. This causes their feathers to wash off, which causes an argument between the dinosaurs as they are frustrated because they can't all look as good as they wanted to. This causes the princess to tell them they don't need feathers to look good, and even decides to throw her own hat with feathers off into the distance. Just like you'd expect from a normal kids show, there seems to be a moral to the story here. However, that cannot be said about the rest of the 50 minutes on this VHS tape. And moving on to the story of Srebrenica, that's where this entire film seems to go off the rails entirely, pushing the bounds of what would be acceptable for a kids show and all the while not making any sense at all. This second story begins with the child being named Srebrenica after a location where something very bad had happened. Now, for the sake of this video being on YouTube, I'm going to flash what happened on the screen right now, and you can pause to read through any part that you'd like. Now, this mass tragedy that took place in 1995 would have been 2 years before this film was created. However, the similarities to this actual event taking place within the context of this story is actually quite limited. I'll revisit the allegory at the end of this. However, the plot continues as the child is torn from her family by a tornado and then cast into the woods, where a poorly animated wolf would take her into her den and raise her as her own. She would wake up from her first nap and would eat a bloodied rat that was given to her by her wolf mother, noting that she enjoyed the taste.
Took a little bite. This isn't bad. She tasted it, and then she shared it with all her brothers and sisters, and they all enjoyed a good meal. They were happy together in the wolf cave under the log.
As the story progresses, she continues to be raised by wolves until she would grow up and continue to eat spiders and worms, until one day a hallucination of a disturbingly animated T-Rex would tell her she isn't an animal and needs to return home to the humans.
Teacher, you do want to be a human again, don't you? Well, let me tell you how. You have to follow the paths in the forest out to where the houses of humans are. You must follow the path until you find a house, and then you must look inside and imitate the people inside, because really you are one of them. You're not a wolf, and I know you're not a dinosaur. We're all extinct. I'm just a dream dinosaur.
Soon after, Srebrenica would break and enter into a random house via the chimney and get stuck in her chimney. Here, her hair would be ripped out by Hansel and Gretel, and when the parents arrive at the scene, she would then be reunited with her family. She would then begin going to school and would bizarrely make a reference to the previous story, Amaluma, and one day, instead of going to school with Hansel and Gretel, she decides to learn to start flying for some reason. She begins flying so fast that she goes back in time 65 million years to visit the dinosaurs. After the story notes she was walking around Australia, she would then fly over a hill, stating that she wanted to warn the dinosaurs of an asteroid that would lead to their extinction. Bizarrely, the story notes that her grand plan to save the dinosaurs was telling them to, quote, store up food, as if storing food would help if they got incinerated by an asteroid. Nonetheless, after Srebrenica gains all of the dinosaurs' attention, this would prompt all of the carnivorous dinosaurs to preemptively start killing all of the other dinosaurs.
But the Deinonychus misunderstood her and just killed the first Euoplocephalus he found and didn't store it away, just left it there on the ground. And then the T-Rex captured a Pachycephalosaurus and threw it to the ground. That was a strange way to store food, but it was the only way the dinosaurs understood. The meat-eaters just killed off all the plant-eaters they could find. They licked their chops.
She would then loot the body of one deceased dinosaur and would fly back to another area, where she would then try to warn the other dinosaurs until one would eat her hair, and she would be bald for the second time. Eventually, Srebrenica would fly home just as the dinosaurs would get wiped out by the asteroid, and when she had returned home, the thing she had looted from the one dinosaur was an egg, and that would eventually hatch, bringing her a new dinosaur best friend. However, at the end, the dinosaur would actually get abandoned by Srebrenica because she was too big to fit in the house, and she would live a normal life, and the story would finally end on this note.
She had to live a very lonely life. Her only friends were Charlie Crow and Patty Possum. But they were so little compared to her. It was hard to even bend her head down to talk to them. She did have a lonely life. One more time she came back to Srebrenica's house and called for her. Come out and play and be my friend." But Srebrenica had become a normal person then, and the poor, sad Pachycephalosaurus had to live the rest of her life all alone.
If you're wondering what this all has to do with the name of the story, to tell you the truth, so am I. While it's speculated that this is tied to be an allegory as to what happened in the real town, as the story includes the raised by wolves trope, where it deals with the idea of what people call home and rejecting others living alongside you, I can't say full well that I fully see the connection between the two things despite this scene.
Srebrenica was a little girl who was born in a country far away. Her mom and dad named her Srebrenica because they'd heard of such a land, a city named that it had a hard time, but then come back into a peaceful state. So they thought that would be a nice name for their new baby.
Many other people who've watched this are quick to point this out as well, and while I'd be interested to see if you guys have any insight on this, there is actually one more story left on this VHS. And this one is perhaps the most deranged one yet, that being Bob the Blob. The story starts out with a doctor who accidentally mixes together a concoction of antibiotics that creates a boy-like creature called Bob, to which the first thing he would do after being born is go stick his hand in the electrical outlet and then get eaten by a rat. The rat ingesting the substance causes him to turn into a lizard and then a giant cat, and like I mentioned earlier, this causes the doctor to launch a nuke into the cat's ass. And when I said the cat's ass, I meant like the narrator specifically mentions, that's where he was aiming.
Dr. Cinti back in the laboratory decided he had to do something to stop this huge cat from ruining the world. He put some antibiotic in a needle and put it into a little rocket to send up to try to catch the giant cat and change it back to a normal-sized animal. Off the rocket went up into the top of the world. He had aimed it carefully enough so that it went right smack into the cat's bum, and the cat began to shrink again.
After casually saving the world, he would shrink the cat down until he creates a new copy of Bob to give to his children. Hereafter, Bob is given to his children as their pet, and the first thing they do with him is take a bath with him, and him getting in the water causes him to disintegrate, killing him. The kids then ask the dad to make a new pet that they will be more careful with this time, and then this new copy of Bob is left alone in the house with nothing to do, and as a result of being bored and having nothing to eat, Bob wanders down the drain to meet a cockroach. He makes friends with the cockroach, and the cockroach is also looking for food, so as a result, he leads him back to the kitchen, thinking that there might be food there. Eventually, the cockroach ends up getting sat on by the mother, and while the boys go to school, they leave Bob in a liquid prison. Bob ends up trying to escape and has both of his legs burned off. And when the boys return home from school, they end up throwing the remains of the cockroach into the Lego house with Bob. This leads to an incredibly disturbing scene.
House, being bored again. What am I supposed to do now, he thought. I don't even have Racha to play with. Jake had thrown in the crushed Racha, who was dead, and Bob thought, they never even gave me anything to eat. So he tried tasting a little bit of Racha, and he ate her almost all up, But then he realized he'd been eating his friend, and he began to cry. He was a sad little Bob the Blob. He cried himself to sleep.
Bob ends up growing wings from eating his friend and haphazardly flies into a vase, melting half of his head off, and subsequently Bob is then invited to the park with the boys where Srebrenica is for some reason, and he ends up dying again. The dad then agrees to make a waterproof version of Bob for the boys again. This time he is waterproof by mixing lizard DNA. They then go to test if this new version of Bob is waterproof and call him a pussy for not wanting to jump in and kill himself. As a result, Bob turns into a cat because they called him a pussy. The boys find it easier to live with a cat and they tell him to stay as a cat, and that is the end of the story. Now, I must say, after diving so deep into this bizarre film and looking at all the backstory, it definitely raises a lot of questions. Who made the film? Who was it made for? And was this actually shown to children? Moreover, why is the film so bizarre, and what is the story behind it? A common theory that people have drifted towards is that this is a type of public access television program or some kind of group/class student project. This does make sense, however, it's very hard to narrow down the specificity of what we're looking at. Based on the clues from the official story, we supposedly know this was found on an unmarked VHS tape from a duplication store in Michigan. And upon looking at all the newspaper archives and other archives related to Nanny Lynn videos, there is really nothing regarding the creation of this video or any places that it was broadcast. The usage of copyright in the video, however, no formal copyright registration, seems to point at this film being rejected or canceled. However, there is one copyright that seems to match up with our story, because there appears to be another unreleased Nanny Lynn series, albeit on book this time. Checking copyright records, it is incredibly interesting that the P.O. box listed for this user is about an hour away from where Hanson Records used to be. And this is the only registered Nanny Lynn copyright that I could find in 2009. And after doing a quick Google search on them, they appear to have a teaching background, so I sent an email and messaged them on a social media platform. I've yet to hear back, but if I do, I will be sure to keep you guys posted, both on Twitter and here, to kind of put this one to rest. However, there's always a chance that I can get things wrong, so to kind of leave this open-ended, what do you think explains the bizarre nature of the entire thing, and what are your theories regarding its creation? Something that tends to be a common theme when it comes to older media is that a bit of context can generally clear up the entire thing, and while this thing may seem morbid and bizarre on the surface level, perhaps there is a very sensible situation that would lead to such a bizarre film's creation. This is Merely Sociable. Have a good night.